It was a hot, sticky afternoon on a highway just outside of New Orleans, the kind of day where the air felt thick, heavy, and unforgiving. Cars were lining up, waiting to pass through a random checkpoint set up by the police. Drivers were anxious, nervously tapping on their steering wheels, but for most of them, this was just another inconvenience. Yet, for one man, it would become much more than that. He was just passing through, minding his own business, when his car was flagged to pull over to the side. The officer, stern-faced and full of authority, approached the window, his eyes narrowing as he got a better look at the man inside. He barely bothered with a greeting. Instead, his first words dripped with suspicion, laced with an unspoken message of judgment. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his tone sharp, commanding, leaving no room for negotiation. The man behind the wheel hesitated for a moment, caught off guard. He was dressed in a neatly pressed suit, the kind that should have been a clear sign of professionalism, but that didn't matter to the officer. It didn't matter that his ID and papers were in perfect order. It didn't matter that he was just another commuter trying to get home. None of that mattered. Because all the officer could see was a black man driving a nice car, and that, to him, was reason enough. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, trying to defuse a situation he could feel spiraling out of control. But his question only seemed to irritate the officer more. "I said, get out of the car," the officer barked, louder this time. "Now." As the man reluctantly stepped out, the officer didn't waste any time. He shoved him against the side of the car, his hands moving quickly to pat him down, searching for something, anything, to justify the hostility in his tone. The officer's grip was rough, almost punishing, as if he was trying to prove a point. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to strip away dignity, to send a message: "You don't belong here." The man tried again, his voice steady but with a hint of strain. "I'm not sure what this is about, but if you just check my ID," the officer cut him off, pushing him harder against the car. "I don't need to check anything," he snapped, his voice low and cold. "People like you always have something to hide. Now, keep your mouth shut unless I ask you a question." There was a stillness in the air, the kind that comes right before a storm. Cars slowed down to watch, eyes widening as they saw what was unfolding on the side of the road. Some passers-by pulled out their phones, recording the scene, whispering to each other. But no one stepped in. No one said a word. The officer continued his aggressive pat-down, ignoring the ID that had been placed on the car hood, ignoring the mounting tension. He was so certain, so arrogantly sure, that this man was nothing more than a criminal trying to hide behind a clean-cut appearance. But he couldn't have been more wrong. He was humiliating someone he thought was just another target, another statistic in his daily grind, unaware of the storm that was about to come crashing down on him. Because the man he had just thrown against the car was no ordinary civilian. He was an agent with the CIA, an agent whose badge carried more weight than any uniform the officer had ever worn. And while he was trained to stay calm, to avoid escalation, there was only so much a person could take. There was only so much a person could be humiliated, degraded, and stripped of their humanity before the truth demanded to be seen. But at that moment, none of that was clear. All that was clear was the officer's harsh voice cutting through the air, the harsh tone of his words as he continued to berate his victim. "You think you're smart, huh? Driving around in a car like this. Where'd you get it, huh? Steal it?" The man's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger rising, but he swallowed it down, trying to remain composed. "I suggest you take a look at my ID," he said, his voice firmer now, a note of warning threading through his calmness. The officer laughed, a short, sharp sound. "I don't need your suggestions," he sneered. "Hands behind your back." And just like that, the officer cuffed him, the cold metal biting into his wrists. People watching from their cars began to murmur louder, their confusion mixing with disbelief. Was this really happening? Was this man really being treated like a criminal without a single piece of evidence? The officer took a step back, admiring his handiwork, as if pleased with how things had played out. He had done this before, and it always ended the same way: another arrest, another statistic. But then, with a calm he didn't expect, the man turned to face him, his eyes steady, unwavering. "You've made a mistake," he said, and there was a chilling certainty in his voice. "And you're going to regret it." The officer's smirk faltered for a split second, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. But he brushed it off, dismissing it as empty defiance. "I don't think so," he said, his voice still dripping with condescension. "Because right now, you're the one in cuffs." But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that the man standing before him had more power than he could comprehend. That the ID on the hood of the car was more than just a card, it was a shield, a badge of authority that could turn his entire world upside down. And in that moment, as the officer tightened the cuffs and prepared to make the arrest official, he had no idea that he was about to pay a heavy price for his actions. This was no ordinary traffic stop. This was a reckoning, and the officer's ignorance was about to cost him everything. Because once the truth came out, once the people watching the scene unfolded saw the ID clearly, once they realized who this man really was, the entire narrative would flip. The officer's smug sense of control would shatter, and he would find himself at the mercy of the very person he tried to demean. What happens when the tables turn? When the man who seemed powerless reveals just how powerful he truly is? And how far will this agent go to ensure that justice is served, not just for himself, but for everyone who has been on the receiving end of this officer's unchecked authority? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything. You won't believe the lengths this man will go to, the truth that will be uncovered, and just how deep this story really goes. This isn't just about one traffic stop, it's about exposing a system that has been allowed to thrive on fear, prejudice, and ignorance. And by the end of it, one thing will be certain: no one is above the law. Hey, everyone! Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for all, no matter your background, skin color, or where you come from. If you're a black viewer, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Now, sit back and enjoy the story we've prepared for you today. We hope it inspires and resonates with you. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. The sun was dipping low over the Mississippi River, casting a warm, golden glow across the streets of New Orleans. The city was alive, bustling with the sound of horns, street performers, and the murmur of tourists exploring the historic French Quarter. Yet, beneath the vibrancy of this city, there were stories that went untold, moments that happened in the shadows, on quieter streets where no one was looking. Tyrone was just getting off a long day. He had been in meetings all afternoon, but not the kind of meetings most people would imagine. He wasn't some corporate executive or an entrepreneur hustling his way through the city's business scene. Tyrone was an agent with the CIA, and today had been one of those days where he was knee-deep in classified briefings, strategies, and intel reports. He was used to the intense pressure, the kind that most people couldn't fathom. It was the nature of his job, a job that had taken years of dedication, training, and sacrifice. And while he was good at keeping his work a secret, there was a sense of pride he carried silently, knowing he was doing his part to keep people safe, even if they never knew his name. New Orleans was home for Tyrone. He had grown up here, in a neighborhood that wasn't on any tourist map. It was a place where resilience was more common than wealth, and where community meant everything. After joining the CIA, he had seen the world, but New Orleans was always where he returned. It was where his roots were, where his family still lived. But this wasn't the New Orleans of jazz clubs and beignets. This was a city layered with complexity, marked by a history of struggle and survival, a place where the lines between right and wrong often blurred. Tyrone was driving home, still dressed in his dark blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that he had loosened just enough to breathe easier. He had his windows down, letting the evening breeze sweep through his car, carrying with it the distant sound of a trumpet playing somewhere in the distance. For him, this was a moment of peace, a brief escape before he returned to the chaos of his work the next morning. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, he preferred to blend in, to be unnoticed, because that's what made him good at his job. But tonight, as he drove down the highway, his mind wandering between thoughts of the day and the comfort of home, he had no idea that he was about to become the center of unwanted attention. At a checkpoint on the highway, Officer Daniels was finishing up his shift. Daniels was known among his colleagues as a man who took his job very seriously. To some, he was a dedicated officer, to others, he was a man who often let his power go to his head. Tall, with a broad frame and a demeanor that made it clear he wasn't one to be challenged, he had a reputation for being strict. But there was more to it than just upholding the law. He had his biases, and they showed in how he treated people. It was an unspoken truth among those who worked with him that Daniels had a habit of profiling, of letting his own prejudices dictate who he stopped and questioned. Tonight, Daniels was tired, but that didn't mean he was any less vigilant. His eyes scanned the cars passing through the checkpoint, a mix of disinterest and keen observation. Most drivers got a quick nod, a wave to keep going. But when Tyrone's black sedan approached, Daniels' gaze sharpened. He saw the nice car, the clean cut of the driver's suit, and then he saw Tyrone's face. Instantly, Daniels felt a flicker of something, an urge to act, to assert himself. In his mind, it was justified. A black man driving a car that nice, alone, at this time of night. It didn't sit right with him, and he decided he would find out why. "Pull over," he called out, gesturing for Tyrone to stop at the side of the road. Tyrone didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a random check, something routine. But as soon as he stepped out of the car, he felt the coldness in Daniel's eyes, the rigid set of his jaw, and he knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Evening, officer," Tyrone said, trying to keep things cordial. "Is there a problem?" Daniels didn't bother with pleasantries. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for questions. Tyrone hesitated for a second, caught off guard by the harshness. But he complied, moving around to the front of the car. Daniels approached slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, as if to make a point. "You mind telling me where you're headed?" he asked, his eyes scanning Tyrone up and down, looking for any sign of nervousness, anything that would give him an excuse to escalate. "Just heading home," Tyrone replied, his voice steady. "I've had a long day." Daniels gave a small, mocking smile. "Oh, I bet you have," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You got ID on you?" Tyrone nodded, pulling out his wallet and handing over his driver's license. But Daniels barely glanced at it before setting it on the hood of the car, as if it meant nothing. "What about registration, proof of ownership?" he asked, leaning in closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's all there in the glove compartment," Tyrone said, starting to feel the tension build. "I can get it for you if—" "Step back," Daniels snapped, cutting him off. "I'll get it myself." Tyrone took a step back, raising his hand slightly, trying to show he had nothing to hide. But as Daniels rummaged through the car, his movements were more invasive than necessary, tossing papers aside, making a mess. It wasn't a search, it was an assertion of control, a way of saying, "I can do whatever I want, and there's nothing you can do about it." Tyrone could feel eyes on him, drivers slowing down to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and confusion. He could hear the whispers, see the flashes of phones being raised to record, and he felt the sting of humiliation, the anger rising in his chest. But he kept his cool, knowing that one wrong move, one wrong word, could make this worse. When Daniels finally finished, he looked back at Tyrone, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. "You're driving a pretty nice car for someone like you," he said, and the words hit like a slap. "How'd you afford it? Drug money? Or did you get a little too cozy with some of your clients?" Tyrone's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew the kind of game Daniels was playing, and he wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. But inside, he was seething. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was a man who had decided, based on nothing but the color of Tyrone's skin, that he had the right to strip him of his dignity, to make him feel small. Daniels saw the tension, saw the way Tyrone was fighting to keep calm, and he pushed harder. "Maybe I should bring you down to the station, see what we find," he said, a threatening edge creeping into his voice. "Bet there's more to your story than you're letting on." The air around them felt heavy, suffocating, as if the whole world had shrunk down to this one moment, this one confrontation. And while Tyrone wanted to scream, to lash out, he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Because he wasn't just a man in a suit. He was something more. And when the time was right, Daniels would find out exactly who he was dealing with. But for now, all Tyrone could do was stand there, hands clenched, as Daniels continued to search for a reason to justify his actions. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the highway, one thing became clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the evening sky darkened, the headlights of passing cars streaked by, casting brief, flickering lights on Tyrone's face as he stood there, hands still raised slightly, the metal cuffs biting into his wrists. Daniels had called for backup, and now 2 more squad cars had arrived, their blue and red lights flashing, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Tyrone felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the eyes watching, the whispers, the humiliation. But through it all, he kept his composure. He had learned long ago how to remain calm under pressure, how to stay in control when everything around him was spinning out. Daniels leaned against Tyrone's car, a smug expression etched on his face. He was enjoying this, basking in the power he had over someone he thought was beneath him. The other officers, equally stern-faced, stood by, watching closely but saying little, letting Daniels take the lead. It was clear that this wasn't the first time Daniels had handled things this way, and they weren't about to intervene. "What's wrong, huh?" Daniels taunted, his voice cutting through the noise of the passing traffic. "Cat got your tongue? You were real talkative before, but now you're awfully quiet." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Tyrone could hear. "You thought you could just drive around here like you own the place? Thought nobody would notice? Well, I noticed. And I'm gonna make sure you don't forget it." Tyrone met Daniels' gaze, his eyes calm but sharp. "I'm not going to forget this," he said quietly, and there was a strength in his voice that made Daniels pause for a brief moment. But the officer quickly shook it off, smirking as he pulled out his flashlight and began inspecting the car again, as if searching for something, anything, that would give him a reason to escalate things further. "Look at this," Daniels said loudly, waving the flashlight around as he opened the trunk. "Brand new, clean, like it just came off the lot. Nice ride for someone like you. Where'd you get the money for this?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Maybe you're one of those fancy boys who likes to pretend they're important. But I see right through it." Tyrone's fists clenched. He could feel the anger rising, the injustice of it all burning inside him. But he knew he had to keep his cool. Losing control now would only give Daniels what he wanted, a reason to make this worse. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to focus, trying to remember who he was and why he couldn't afford to let this man provoke him. One of the other officers, a younger man who looked like he hadn't been on the force for long, shifted uncomfortably. "Daniels, maybe we should just let him go," he said, his voice barely more than a murmur. "He's got his ID, his registration checks out. I mean, there's nothing here." Daniels shot him a glare, and the young officer quickly looked away, his mouth snapping shut. "You let me handle this," Daniels snapped. "This guy's hiding something, and I'm gonna find out what." Tyrone glanced at the young officer, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes, the flicker of doubt. But it was clear that Daniels was the one in charge, and nobody was going to challenge him. Not tonight. "Listen, officer," Tyrone said, his voice steady but firm. I don't want any trouble. I've complied with everything you asked. I've shown you my ID. I've told you who I am. Just let me get my things and, Daniels cut him off, slamming the trunk shut with a loud bang that echoed down the highway. Oh, you don't want trouble, he said, mocking the words. Well, that's too bad, because trouble's what you're getting. He stepped closer, his face inches from Tyrone's, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. I can make this easy, or I can make this hard. But I'm not letting you walk away like nothing happened. The threat hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Tyrone could feel the tension, the way Daniels was trying to provoke him, to push him to a breaking point. He could see the officers watching, their faces blank, their expressions unreadable. It was a game, and Daniels was determined to win. But Tyrone wasn't playing. He had been trained to read people, to understand what made them tick, and he could see right through Daniels' bravado. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about control, about one man trying to assert his power over another, and Tyrone wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Why are you doing this? Tyrone asked, his voice calm, almost soft. What do you get out of this? For a moment, Daniels' smirk faltered, as if he hadn't expected the question. But then it returned, sharper than before. You think you're clever, don't you? He said, his tone dripping with disdain. Think you're better than me, huh? Driving around in your nice suit, your fancy car, acting like you belong here. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. But I know you're kind. I know exactly who you are. Tyrone felt his heart pound in his chest, but he kept his voice even. You don't know anything about me. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Maybe not. But I'm gonna find out. He turned to the young officer, gesturing for him to bring over the squad car's computer. Run his license again. Check everything. I want to know who he is, where he's been, what he's done. The young officer hesitated, glancing nervously at Tyrone before nodding and walking over to the car. Tyrone could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he seemed unsure of what he was doing. But it didn't matter. Daniels was in control, and everyone else was just following his lead. As the young officer typed in Tyrone's information, there was a moment of silence, a lull in the chaos that felt almost surreal. Tyrone could hear the soft hum of the computer, the distant murmur of traffic, the quiet whispers of onlookers who had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. And then, something changed. The young officer's eyes widened, and he glanced up at Daniels, his expression a mix of confusion and shock. Sir, he said, his voice hesitant. I think you should see this. Daniels frowned, walking over to the computer. What is it? He demanded, leaning over to look at the screen. For a moment, he was silent, his eyes scanning the information. And then, slowly, he straightened up, his face going pale. What the hell, he muttered, his voice barely audible. He turned to Tyrone, and for the first time that night, there was no smirk, no hint of arrogance. There was only confusion, and something that looked a lot like fear. Tyrone watched him, his expression unreadable. He could see the shift, the way Daniels was starting to realize that he had made a mistake, a big one. But Tyrone didn't say anything. He just waited, letting the silence stretch, letting Daniels process what he had just seen. The other officers were staring now, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. They had no idea what was happening, but they could sense that something had changed, that the situation had taken a turn they hadn't expected. What's going on, Daniels? One of them asked, his voice cautious. What did you find? Daniels didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at Tyrone, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who are you? He asked finally, his voice shaky, the confidence he had before now completely gone. Tyrone didn't respond right away. He let the question hang in the air, knowing that the answer was coming, and that when it did, everything would change. He could see the fear starting to creep into Daniel's eyes, the realization that he wasn't the one in control anymore. But this was just the beginning. Tyrone could feel the tension building, the pressure rising, and he knew that the moment was coming when everything would be revealed. Daniels had spent the night trying to humiliate him, trying to strip him of his dignity, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. And when the truth came out, it was going to hit like a hammer, shattering everything Daniels thought he knew. Tyrone could see it coming, could feel it in the air, and he was ready. "Let's just say," he said quietly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "you're about to find out exactly who I am. And when you do, you're going to wish you had never stopped me." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise, and Daniels could only stare, his mind racing, trying to piece together what he had missed, what he had overlooked. But it was too late. The tables were turning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The question was no longer if, but when. And the answer was coming, whether Daniels was ready for it or not. Daniels' eyes were glued to the computer screen, the flickering light reflecting off his now pale face. The young officer beside him stood still, awkwardly shifting his weight, clearly unsure of what to do next. The screen held information that was shaking Daniels to his core, but he wasn't the only one affected. Tyrone stood silently by his car, watching the scene unfold, his expression calm, almost as if he had been expecting this moment all along. The red and blue lights from the squad cars continued to flash, cutting through the darkened highway, as if they were announcing that something significant was about to happen. What is this?" Daniels finally muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked up at Tyrone, confusion mingling with fear. "This can't be right." Tyrone's eyes were sharp, piercing through the dark, and he took a slow step forward, closing the gap between them. "Oh, it's right," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying an authority that made Daniel's heart race. "It's exactly right. And now, you're starting to understand the gravity of what you've done." Daniels tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. The young officer cleared his throat nervously, breaking the tense silence. "Sir, maybe we should, shut up," Daniels snapped, his voice harsh and panicked, like a man grasping at straws. He wasn't ready to lose control, not yet. He turned back to the screen, his eyes darting over the information, as if he could somehow find a way to make it all disappear. But the truth was there, undeniable. Tyrone wasn't just some random guy he could push around. He was a CIA agent, and a highly ranked one at that. "I told you to check my ID," Tyrone said, taking another step forward. "But you didn't want to listen. You thought you knew everything about me just by looking at me. Now, you're starting to see just how wrong you were." Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. He had planned to show this man his place, to make it clear who was in control. But now, he was the one losing control, and it felt like the ground was slipping out from under him. This doesn't change anything," he stammered, trying to regain some of his composure. "You still resisted, you still resisted." Tyrone interrupted, his voice rising, carrying a sharp edge. "You shoved me against my own car, handcuffed me, and humiliated me in front of everyone. I didn't resist. I complied. And still, you treated me like a criminal." He took a step closer, and now they were face to face, the air between them thick with tension. "Do you even realize what you've done?" The young officer looked from Tyrone to Daniels, then back to Tyrone, clearly torn. "Sir," he said, addressing Daniels, "maybe we should just, enough." Daniels shouted, his voice cracking. He glared at Tyrone, his eyes wild with desperation. "I'm still the one giving orders here. I don't care who you are. You're under arrest." Tyrone's lips curled into a small, cold smile, and for the first time that night, there was a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, yet it carried like a command. "Then why don't you go ahead and call your precinct?" Let them know you've arrested an officer of the Central Intelligence Agency. Let's see how well that goes for you." The words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of distant traffic, the occasional honking of a car horn, and the low murmur of bystanders, who had now formed a small crowd, their phones still recording. Tyrone's calm demeanor, his control over the situation, only made Daniels' panic worse. "You don't get it, do you?" Tyrone continued, his voice like ice. "This isn't just about tonight. This is about every time you've done this, every time you've abused your power because you thought you could. You thought I was nobody. But you were wrong. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Daniel's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but he couldn't think of a way out. I was just doing my job," he stammered, though the words felt hollow, even to him. You were profiling," Tyrone said, cutting him off. "You saw a black man in a nice car, and you decided that was enough to stop me. Enough to treat me like a criminal. And you thought you'd get away with it because you always have before." He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But tonight, you picked the wrong person." Daniel's mind was racing, but he couldn't find a way to fight back. He had spent his career asserting his authority, but now, for the first time, he was being confronted by someone who wouldn't back down, someone who wasn't afraid. You can't do this," he said, but there was no conviction in his words, just a hollow plea. "You can't ruin my life over one mistake." "One mistake?" Tyrone repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to stop me, to humiliate me, to treat me like I was less than you. And now, you're going to face the consequences of that choice." The young officer, still standing by the squad car, looked at Daniels, his expression one of quiet horror. "Daniels, maybe we should let him go," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If he really is CIA, this could get serious. We could lose our jobs." Daniels looked at the young officer, and for a moment, his expression softened, as if he was about to concede. But then he clenched his jaw, his eyes hardening. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not letting him get away with this. I'm not letting him make a fool out of me." Tyrone let out a small, bitter laugh. "You still don't understand," he said. "You already made a fool out of yourself. You did it the moment you decided to abuse your power. And now, you're going to see just how serious this really is." Tyrone took out his phone, the action slow and deliberate, and began to dial. Daniel's eyes widened, and he took a step forward, his hand twitching as if he wanted to grab the phone out of Tyrone's hand. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "I'm making a call," Tyrone said simply. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what happened here tonight. I'm going to make sure they see exactly who you are." Daniels lunged forward, but before he could reach Tyrone, a voice crackled over the radio, loud and clear. "Dispatch to Officer Daniels, report your status." Daniels froze, his hand still outstretched, his face pale. The young officer picked up the radio, his hands shaking. We've got a situation," he said, his voice barely steady. "There's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Tyrone echoed, his tone mocking. "Is that what you're calling it now?" Daniels snatched the radio from the young officer's hand, his grip tight, his knuckles white. "This is Officer Daniels," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're handling it." Tyrone took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "You're not handling anything," he said. "Not anymore." And then, before Daniels could say another word, Tyrone hit send on his phone. The call connected, and a voice, cool and authoritative, came through the speaker. "This is Central Intelligence. Identify yourself." Daniels' eyes widened, and he shook his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "No. No, this can't be happening," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tyrone held the phone up, making sure Daniels could hear every word. "This is Special Agent Tyrone Blake, identification number 45890. I'm currently being detained by Officer Daniels of the New Orleans Police Department, without cause, and I'm requesting immediate assistance." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniels' face drained of color, and the young officer's mouth hung open, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Agent Blake, we are tracking your location. Stay on the line. Backup is on the way." Daniels stumbled back, his legs suddenly weak, and he looked at Tyrone with something that resembled pure terror. You called for backup," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "You're bringing the CIA." Tyrone's expression was cold, unyielding. "That's right," he said. "And they're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you did tonight." The words hit Daniels like a punch, and he took a step back, shaking his head. "You can't do this," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You can't, I already did," Tyrone said, cutting him off. "And now, there's nothing you can do to stop it." The reality of the situation finally began to sink in, and Daniels looked around, as if hoping to find a way out, a way to undo everything that had happened. But there was no escape, no way to erase the night's events. The tables had turned, and Tyrone was the one in control now. As the sound of sirens began to grow louder in the distance, cutting through the dark like a warning, Daniels could only stand there, frozen, as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. Tyrone watched him, his eyes hard, unflinching, as he prepared to deliver the final blow. "You wanted to make me feel small, to show me who was in charge," he said, his voice low, cold. "But now, the whole world is going to see who you really are. And there's nothing you can do to change that." The sirens grew louder, closer, and for the first time all night, Daniels was truly speechless. He had tried to assert his power, but now, he was about to learn what real power looked like. And as the flashing lights approached, bathing them all in a harsh, unforgiving light, one thing was clear: this was just the beginning. The sound of approaching sirens pierced through the thick night air, their wail growing louder with each passing second. Daniel's face was ashen, his eyes darting around, looking for something, anything, that could save him from the mess he'd created. But there was no escaping the reality that was closing in on him. Tyrone stood still, his phone still in hand, his expression unwavering. There was no hint of satisfaction on his face, only a cold, controlled calmness that made it clear he was not someone to be trifled with. The flashing lights grew brighter, and soon, several unmarked cars pulled up to the scene, alongside additional police vehicles. Doors swung open, and men in dark suits stepped out, their movements efficient and purposeful. They carried an air of authority, the kind that silenced any doubts about who was really in control now. One of them, a tall man with a sharp, focused gaze, approached Tyrone and nodded. "Agent Blake," he said, his voice crisp, professional. "We received your call." Daniel's heart skipped a beat at the word agent. He opened his mouth, trying to form words, but nothing came out. It was as if the reality of the situation had finally rendered him mute, and the power he once wielded so carelessly had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. Tyrone nodded back at the man, but his eyes never left Daniel's. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that resonated through the night. "I wanted to ensure that this situation was handled appropriately." The agent who had spoken glanced briefly at Daniels, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the man before turning back to Tyrone. "We'll take care of it from here," he said, and there was a finality in his tone that made it clear this was not a suggestion. "Do you wish to press charges, Agent Blake?" Daniel's eyes widened, and he stumbled forward, his hands raised as if in surrender. "Wait. Please," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. This This is all just a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I didn't know who he was. Tyrone finally turned to face him fully, his gaze piercing. And what difference would it have made if you did? He asked quietly, but the question struck like a hammer. Would you have treated me with respect only because of my position? Would you have acted differently if you knew I had the power to call in reinforcements? He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Daniel's, and for the first time, his voice was filled with a quiet, controlled fury. That's the problem. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me like a human being. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning, and Daniels felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. I'm sorry, he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. I was just doing my job. Doing your job. Tyrone repeated, his tone incredulous. Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and humiliate. But you made a choice. You chose to use your badge as a weapon, to assert your power over someone you thought was powerless. And now, you have to live with the consequences of that choice. One of the CIA agents stepped forward, addressing the police officers who had gathered nearby. We need to speak with Officer Daniels, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And we need to do it now. The young officer who had been standing by earlier looked at Daniels, then back at the agent, and for a moment, he seemed torn. But finally, he nodded, taking a step back, as if distancing himself from the man he had once followed without question. Yes, sir, he said quietly. We'll cooperate. Daniels felt a wave of panic surge through him, and he turned to the young officer, his eyes wild. You can't let them do this, he pleaded, his voice desperate. I'm one of you. We're supposed to have each other's backs. The young officer looked at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of defiance in his eyes. I don't have your back if this is what you're doing, he said, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly. This isn't what I signed up for. The admission hit Daniels harder than any physical blow could have. He had always assumed that his authority would protect him, that his fellow officers would stand by him no matter what. But now, as he stood there, alone and exposed, he realized just how wrong he had been. He turned back to Tyrone, a pitiful, pleading look on his face. Please, he said, his voice cracking. I'm begging you. Don't ruin my life over this. I'll lose my job, my family, everything. Tyrone's eyes softened for just a moment, but there was no pity in his gaze, only a sad, weary understanding. You think your life is the only one at stake here? He asked softly. How many lives have you affected by doing exactly what you did to me tonight? How many people have you treated like criminals just because you thought you could get away with it? Daniels didn't have an answer. He couldn't even bring himself to look at Tyrone. He had spent years justifying his actions, telling himself that he was keeping the streets safe, that he was just doing what needed to be done. But now, as he stood there, stripped of his authority, he realized how hollow those justifications were. The lead agent stepped forward, his expression impassive. Officer Daniels, you're being placed under investigation for misconduct and abuse of authority, he said, his voice calm but firm. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you. Daniel's face contorted with fear, and he looked around wildly, as if hoping to find someone, anyone, who would come to his aid. But the other officers were silent, their faces blank, their eyes avoiding his. You can't do this, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't mean to, but you did, Tyrone said, his voice quiet but unyielding. And now, you have to face the consequences. Just like every person you've ever wronged had to face the consequences of your actions. There was a long, tense silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the low murmur of onlookers who had gathered, watching from a distance. Daniels looked at Tyrone, his eyes filled with desperation, but there was no sympathy left to be found. Tyrone had given him a chance to see reason, to step back and make things right. But Daniels had ignored it, and now, it was too late. As the agents moved to take Daniels into custody, he felt a surge of anger, a last, desperate attempt to reclaim the power that had slipped from his grasp. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, his voice raw, his eyes burning with resentment. "You're no different. You're just hiding behind your badge, just like I was." Tyrone's eyes flashed, but he remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I am hiding behind a badge," he said, his voice even. "But the difference is, I use mine to protect people, not to hurt them. I use mine to make sure that people like you can't get away with what you did tonight." The words cut through the night, clear and sharp, and Daniels felt them like a slap. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, as someone who could bend the rules because he believed he was the one enforcing them. But now, as he was led away in handcuffs, he realized just how fragile that sense of power had been. Tyrone watched him go, the flashing lights illuminating the scene, and for a moment, he felt a pang of sadness. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind that made people believe they were above the rules, above the law. But no one was, and that was a lesson Daniels had learned the hard way tonight. The young officer approached Tyrone, his eyes downcast, but there was a hint of something, maybe regret, maybe respect. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "For everything." Tyrone looked at him, his expression softening just slightly. "It's not me you should be apologizing to," he said. "It's everyone who's ever been treated the way I was tonight. Make sure this doesn't happen again. Make sure you do better." The young officer nodded, his face solemn. "I will," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that Tyrone hadn't heard before. As the night began to wind down, the agents gathered around Tyrone, asking if he needed anything, if there was anything more they could do. But he shook his head, his mind already far away, thinking about the long drive home, about the day he had just endured. "I'm fine," he said, his voice quiet, but steady. "Thank you." The lead agent nodded, his expression respectful. "You handled yourself well tonight, Agent Blake," he said. "If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to reach out." Tyrone nodded, but he didn't say anything more. He watched as the cars began to disperse, the flashing lights fading into the distance, leaving the highway bathed in darkness once more. The crowd that had gathered slowly began to dissolve, and soon, it was just Tyrone, standing by his car, the cool night air finally starting to clear his head. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and for the first time all night, he allowed himself to relax. He had been pushed, tested, but he hadn't broken. And now, as he looked up at the starless sky, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that tonight, justice had been served. But as he turned to get into his car, he couldn't help but think about all the others who had been in his position, who hadn't had the power to fight back. He knew there was still a long way to go, that there were still so many battles left to be fought. But tonight, he had won, and that was something. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of the car wrapping around him like a comforting blanket, and he started the engine. The hum of the motor was steady, reassuring, and as he pulled back onto the highway, he felt the tension of the night finally begin to melt away. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain, he would never let anyone take away his dignity again. The road stretched out before him, dark and endless, but for the first time all night, he felt like he could breathe. And as the city lights began to fade behind him, he drove on, into the quiet, into the peace, leaving the chaos of the night behind. As Tyrone drove through the dark, open stretch of highway, he could still see the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, growing smaller and dimmer until they disappeared completely. But even though the night seemed calm now, his mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened. The encounter with Daniels had been brutal, humiliating, but also revealing. Tyrone had seen a side of power he was all too familiar with, a power that thrived on fear, on the belief that some people were untouchable. And tonight, for once, he had been able to flip that script. But this wasn't just about one night, or one confrontation. Tyrone knew that Daniels wasn't unique, he was just a symptom of a larger problem. There were many more out there like him, officers who believed that their badge gave them the right to judge and mistreat others without consequences. As Tyrone navigated the quiet streets, he felt a heavy responsibility weighing on him. The satisfaction of seeing justice served tonight was real, but it was fleeting. What he really wanted was change, something that went deeper than one officer getting reprimanded or losing his job. He wanted to make sure that others wouldn't have to endure what he had. Back at the precinct, the fallout from the night's events had already begun. Daniels was taken to a separate room, where the lead agent from the CIA began questioning him. The atmosphere was tense, heavy, and for once, Daniels didn't have his usual bravado. He sat there, slumped in the metal chair, his hands trembling slightly, as he tried to wrap his head around the reality that was crashing down on him. "Do you understand the seriousness of what happened tonight?" the agent asked, his voice calm, measured, but with an edge that left no room for evasion. "Do you understand the impact of your actions?" Daniels nodded slowly, but it was clear that he was still struggling to process it all. I didn't know who he was," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if repeating the same defense would somehow absolve him. "If I had known," the agent raised an eyebrow, and for a moment, there was silence, a silence that seemed to stretch on endlessly. "And if you had known," he finally said, leaning forward, his eyes locked onto Daniels. "Would you have treated him differently because he's a CIA agent, or because you realized he had the power to call in backup? What if he had been just an ordinary man? Would you have shown him the same courtesy, the same respect?" Daniels didn't have an answer. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the words had been stripped from him. The agent's eyes narrowed, and he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's the problem, Officer Daniels. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to act on your prejudice, to use your authority as a weapon. And now, you're going to face the consequences of that choice." As the interrogation continued, news of what had happened began to spread. The video footage taken by onlookers was already circulating online, and within hours, it was being shared across social media, accompanied by hashtags calling for accountability and justice. It wasn't just a local story anymore, it was national. People were watching, waiting to see how this would play out, and they weren't going to let it be swept under the rug. The next morning, as Tyrone sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed with notifications. He had messages from colleagues, friends, even strangers who had seen the footage. Some were congratulatory, praising him for standing up, for using his position to bring attention to what had happened. Others were angry, frustrated, asking why it took someone in his position to make this issue visible. Why wasn't it enough when ordinary people spoke out? Tyrone couldn't blame them. He had asked himself the same questions. Why did it take a badge, a title, to make people listen? He knew that what happened last night was just one example, a brief moment where the scales had tipped in favor of justice, but he also knew how easily things could have gone the other way. He looked out the window, watching as the sun began to rise over the rooftops, casting a warm, golden light across the neighborhood. It was a new day, but the fight was far from over. Tyrone had been given a platform, a chance to make a difference, and he was determined to use it. Later that day, Daniels was called into a hearing with the police department's internal affairs unit. The room was cold, sterile, and the people inside were not interested in hearing excuses. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Daniels felt small as he sat there, facing a panel of stern faces, knowing that his every word would be scrutinized. He had never felt this vulnerable before, and it was a feeling he didn't like. "You've been accused of racial profiling, abuse of power, and misconduct," one of the investigators said, reading off the list of charges. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Officer Daniels?" Daniels shifted in his seat, his mind scrambling for a defense, but all he could come up with were the same empty words. "I was just doing my job," he said, but even he didn't believe it anymore. The investigator's eyes darkened, and he shook his head. "No, you weren't," he said firmly. Your job is to serve and protect. What you did was target and intimidate. There's a difference, and you crossed that line. For once, Daniels had no retort, no snide remark. He just sat there, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had always thought of himself as the one in control, but now, he was the one being judged, and there was no escaping it. Meanwhile, Tyrone was contacted by a local news station, asking for an interview. They wanted to hear his side of the story, to get his perspective on what had happened and what he thought should be done to prevent it from happening again. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted to relive the events of that night, to expose himself to the scrutiny that would come with speaking out. But then he thought about all the people who had reached out to him, the ones who had thanked him, and the ones who had demanded more. When Tyrone arrived at the studio, he was greeted by a reporter, a young woman with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. They sat down in front of the cameras, the bright lights illuminating their faces, and after a brief introduction, the reporter got straight to the point. "Agent Blake, can you tell us what was going through your mind when you were stopped by Officer Daniels that night?" Tyrone took a deep breath, letting the question settle in the air before he answered. "Honestly, I was scared," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Not because I thought he would hurt me, but because I knew how easily things could escalate. I knew that if I reacted the wrong way, if I let my emotions get the best of me, it could end badly. And that's not a fear anyone should have to live with." The reporter nodded, her expression serious. "And what do you think needs to change to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Tyrone's eyes hardened, and he leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We need accountability," he said. "We need to make sure that officers who abuse their power are held responsible. But more than that, we need to change the culture that allows this kind of behavior to exist in the first place. It's not just about punishing the bad actors, it's about creating an environment where this kind of prejudice isn't tolerated, where people are treated with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." The interview aired that evening, and it sparked a wave of conversations across the city, and then across the country. People began sharing their own stories, their own experiences with profiling and discrimination, and soon, what had started as a single incident was becoming a larger movement. Daniels, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The news of his actions had spread throughout the department, and he could feel the judgment in the eyes of his colleagues whenever he passed them in the hall. He had always prided himself on being respected, on having a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense officer. But now, that reputation was in ruins, and he was left to pick up the pieces. As the days passed, Tyrone's story continued to gain traction. It was covered on national news, debated on talk shows, and discussed in town halls. But for Tyrone, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about using his voice, his platform, to make sure that others wouldn't have to go through what he did. And yet, he knew that real change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But he was ready to fight, because he knew that if there was one thing he had learned from that night, it was that silence only served to protect the oppressor. And he wasn't going to stay silent anymore. As he walked through the streets of New Orleans, seeing the city he loved in a new light, he felt a sense of purpose, a clarity he hadn't felt before. The journey ahead was long, and there were still battles to be fought. But he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The world was watching now, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The investigation into Daniels' conduct moved swiftly. With the video evidence, testimonies from bystanders, and the official statement from Tyrone, there was no room for ambiguity. Daniels was formally charged with misconduct, abuse of authority, and racial profiling. The department, under immense public pressure, made an example out of him. For years, he had acted with impunity, but now he faced the reality of his actions, demotion, loss of benefits, and the beginning of a long legal battle that could end his career permanently. The man who once believed he was untouchable had been brought down by his own arrogance, exposed to the very judgment he had so often dished out to others. But the consequences didn't stop there. The scandal triggered an internal review of the department's policies, bringing to light similar complaints against other officers. Daniels became a symbol of a deeper, systemic issue, and the department was forced to confront the culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive. It was a reckoning, and while Daniels had lost his power, the ripples of his downfall were far-reaching. For the first time, real changes were being discussed: mandatory bias training, stricter accountability measures, and better community oversight. Tyrone watched all this unfold with a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to become a symbol, but if his experience could spark change, he was willing to embrace that role. The interview he gave had gone viral, and he found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't anticipated. People from all over the country reached out to him, sharing their own stories, their own encounters with injustice. He listened, he empathized, and he realized that he had a responsibility to use his voice, not just as a CIA agent, but as a citizen who understood the struggle firsthand. 1 week after the incident, Tyrone was invited to speak at a community forum in New Orleans, organized by local activists who had been inspired by his story. The room was packed, filled with people of all ages, colors, and backgrounds. As he took the stage, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore, he was standing up for all those who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady yet resonant, carrying across the room. "A week ago, I was just another person on my way home, trying to live my life. But something happened that night that reminded me of an important truth: power doesn't come from a badge or a title. It comes from how you treat people, how you respect their dignity, no matter who they are." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. "What happened to me was a painful reminder of how far we still have to go. But it was also a reminder that change is possible. When we speak up, when we demand accountability, when we refuse to be treated as less than human, we make it clear that we deserve better. And we will get better." As Tyrone spoke, Daniels watched from afar, his face unreadable. He had been invited to the forum, but he had chosen to stay in the back, unnoticed. He didn't know why he had come, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of guilt. As he listened to Tyrone's words, he felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of regret and shame. For the first time, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions, not just as an officer, but as a human being who had failed to see the humanity in others. After the forum, Tyrone was approached by people who wanted to thank him, to share their stories, to ask him what would come next. But he wasn't looking for praise. He was looking for solutions, for ways to turn this moment into lasting change. That night, he spoke with local leaders, activists, and even some members of the police department who had come to listen. They discussed plans to create a task force focused on community police relations, and Tyrone offered to be a part of it, ensuring that his experience would contribute to real, actionable progress. As the night drew to a close, Tyrone stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that while the battle wasn't over, he had done something that mattered. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a call for justice, and that was something no one could take away from him. Daniels, standing in the shadows, watched as Tyrone spoke with the community, laughing, shaking hands, and offering words of encouragement. He felt a pang of something he hadn't expected: admiration. For so long, he had believed that strength came from control, from dominance. But tonight, he saw a different kind of strength, one that was built on compassion, resilience, and integrity. As Tyrone turned to leave, he noticed Daniels standing there, half hidden by the darkness. For a moment, their eyes met, and Daniels hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice low and uncertain. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize. I didn't understand." Tyrone looked at him, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, he nodded. "Maybe you didn't," he said quietly. "But now you do. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? Daniels didn't have an answer, but the question lingered, echoing in his mind long after Tyrone had walked away. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to make amends. What does it mean to truly see someone, to acknowledge their dignity and humanity, regardless of their status, their job, or the color of their skin? Tonight's story wasn't just about an encounter between a police officer and a CIA agent, it was about power, prejudice, and the choices we make every day. It was about the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better, even when it's difficult. Tyrone didn't need a badge to prove his worth, and neither do you. His story reminds us that real strength comes from respect, empathy, and the willingness to confront injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. And for Officer Daniels, it was a hard lesson in humility, a reminder that power without accountability is dangerous. So, what would you do if you were in Tyrone's shoes? Would you have the courage to stand up, to demand justice, even when the odds are against you? And what can we, as a society, do to ensure that no one else has to endure what he did? Share your thoughts, your stories, your ideas in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation, because change starts with each of us. If you found this story moving, if it made you think, feel, or see things in a new light, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us at Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke thought. And don't forget to like the video and share it with others who need to hear it. Thanks for watching, and remember, no one is above the law, but everyone deserves to be treated with respect.